The sun had just begun to rise over the quiet tree-lined streets of Oak Ridge Lane, casting a golden glow over the neatly manicured lawns and white picket fences. The neighborhood was the kind of place where every house looked like it belonged in a magazine, immaculate, uniform, and perfect. Birds chirped from the branches, a light breeze rustled through the leaves, and the smell of fresh-cut grass lingered in the air. It was the kind of place that felt like it existed outside of time, peaceful, serene, almost too perfect. It was early, still that magical moment before the world fully woke up, and most of Oak Ridge's residents were either still asleep or already sipping coffee in their kitchens. But not everyone. There was one person who had already started his day. A tall, well-built black man in his early 30s jogged down the sidewalk, his rhythmic footfalls echoing lightly in the still morning air. He wore a black athletic shirt and matching shorts, a pair of high-end running shoes, and headphones tucked in his ears as he lost himself in the beat of his playlist. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't running from anything, but his stride was smooth, purposeful. To him, this was just another morning run, an escape from the demands of the world. His expression was calm, focused, unaware of the watchful eyes following him. Across the street, just up the block, stood a middle-aged white woman walking her small, fluffy dog. She was dressed in a light sweater, yoga pants, and designer sunglasses that seemed a bit out of place for the quiet, sleepy street. Her blonde hair was neatly styled, and her posture was straight, as if even the slightest slouch would be a betrayal of her well-maintained image. She stopped mid-step, holding the leash tighter as she watched the jogger. Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly, a flash of suspicion crossing her face. He didn't belong here. That thought lingered in her mind, as persistent as the rhythmic thump of his running shoes. The neighborhood was hers, her sanctuary. Sure, there were occasional strangers walking through, but this man? He wasn't just a stranger. He didn't fit. Not in her perfect, picture-perfect world. His presence felt out of place, and it set something off in her chest. She muttered under her breath, though there was no one around to hear her. "Probably just passing through," she said, though there was a sharp edge to her words, the kind of edge that hinted at something deeper, something unspoken. Her eyes followed him as he continued jogging past her house, his pace steady, oblivious to the thoughts racing through her head. She clenched her jaw. He wasn't supposed to be here. The discomfort gnawed at her, but she didn't know why. Perhaps it was his confident posture, his calmness, or just the fact that he was there, in a place where she felt only people like her should belong. And as he passed by her house, a strange, almost irrational urge took hold of her. Her hand reached for her phone. The jogger's steady pace was unbroken as he rounded the corner and continued down the peaceful suburban street. He had always found solace in early morning runs. There was something about the quiet before the world came to life, something that made him feel more centered, more at ease. Today was no different. And despite the growing weight of 1,000 thoughts in his mind, the rhythmic motion of his legs and the beat of his music offered a welcome distraction. But as his feet hit the sidewalk with each stride, the tension across the street seemed to simmer. The woman, her eyes narrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line, watched him with a growing sense of unease. He was still unaware of her gaze, but she wasn't just watching him now. She was studying him. From his athletic build to his well-maintained clothes, everything about him seemed out of place. This neighborhood, with its perfectly trimmed lawns and pristine houses, had always been a haven for people like her, people who shared a similar lifestyle, similar values. He didn't belong here, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her fingers gripped the leash tighter as her dog tugged at it, sensing its owner's growing agitation. She didn't know what had made her so uncomfortable, but the more she thought about it, the more the feeling festered. Maybe it was his calm demeanor, unruffled, unbothered. Or maybe it was just the fact that, in a neighborhood like this, a black man jogging alone in the early morning felt like an anomaly. The idea that someone could be out of place in a community like hers triggered something in her. A deep-rooted instinct, one she didn't question, one she didn't even recognize as a problem. She reached for her phone. Her fingers trembled slightly, and as she unlocked the screen, her mind raced with rationalizations. It wasn't that she was afraid, but something didn't sit right. She needed confirmation. She needed to feel safe again. She dialed 911. The phone rang twice before a calm, professional voice answered. 911. What's your emergency? Hi. Yes, she began, her voice taking on a measured tone, though it carried an undercurrent of worry. I'm calling about a suspicious man in my neighborhood. There was a brief pause, but she could sense the operator's readiness to act. This was serious. Her unease was real, wasn't it? She had every right to be concerned. He's jogging down Oak Ridge Lane, she continued, and he's not from around here. I've never seen him before, and I don't feel safe. Her voice tightened with every word, a subtle edge creeping into her tone. He's acting suspiciously, wearing athletic clothes, headphones in his ears, not acknowledging anyone as he passes. I think he might be dangerous. The operator responded swiftly, asking for a description. She provided details about his height, his build, and his outfit, and then added something else, something coded, something that wasn't explicitly said, but was woven into her description nonetheless. I don't think he belongs here, she muttered. Not in this neighborhood. Her words hung in the air, the subtle implication of her bias clear to anyone listening. She had already made up her mind, and now she simply needed the police to back her up. The operator, maintaining a professional calm, assured her that an officer would be dispatched shortly. Stay inside your home and avoid confrontation, they advised. She nodded, even though the operator couldn't see her, as if that would somehow solidify her righteousness. Her heart still raced. Her hands were slightly sweaty. She felt the satisfaction of having done something, of taking action, but it didn't feel like relief. The tension was still there, gnawing at her gut. Meanwhile, the jogger continued his route, unaware of the storm brewing just across the street. He had caught a glimpse of her watching him a few moments ago, but he thought little of it. It wasn't unusual for people to glance at him when he ran through different neighborhoods. Sometimes it was curiosity. Sometimes it was something else entirely. He glanced back toward her house and saw her standing there, phone pressed to her ear, but he didn't think much of it. After all, it was just another morning run, another set of miles to clear his head. But then, as he turned a corner further down the street, he saw the flashing lights in his rear view. Red and blue hues lit up the darkening road, cutting through the quiet of the morning. He slowed his pace, unsure of the reason for the attention but not overly concerned. Maybe they were after someone else. Maybe they were just patrolling. But as the car slowed beside him, the officer's window rolled down, and a voice called out. "Sir, can I speak with you for a moment?" The jogger, now realizing the situation wasn't entirely ordinary, stopped and took out one of his earbuds. The officer looked professional, but there was a palpable tension in the air. The officer was young, early 30s. "Is there a problem, officer?" the jogger asked, trying to read the situation. He wasn't angry yet, just confused. "We received a call about suspicious activity in this area," the officer explained, scanning the neighborhood briefly before his eyes landed back on the jogger. "A woman reported seeing you running here, said you seemed out of place. She felt uncomfortable." The jogger's brows furrowed. "Out of place?" he repeated, his voice calm but laced with a hint of disbelief. "I'm just jogging." The officer hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Can I see some ID just to confirm everything's all right?" The jogger sighed, reaching into his pocket and retrieving his driver's license. "Sure, no problem. It's just weird, you know?" he said, handing it over. "I'm just here to exercise. No harm meant." The officer took the ID, glancing at it briefly. "I understand." Just a routine check, all right? The jogger nodded, but as he stood there, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He hadn't done anything wrong, but the tension in the air was palpable now, and it was hard to ignore the underlying implication. Someone had seen him, a black man, jogging, and had immediately deemed him suspicious. The officer stepped back, likely waiting for some sort of confirmation. The jogger felt an odd mix of frustration and confusion, but mostly he felt tired. He had dealt with this before, being looked at differently for no reason at all, simply because of how he looked. Still, he was patient. He would let the officer do his job. But what he didn't know was that the woman who had called the police, who had felt so uneasy, was watching from her porch. Her face ashen now as the realization of what she had just done started to settle in. From across the street, the woman stood frozen, her phone pressed to her ear as she kept her eyes locked on the scene unfolding before her. Her hand was shaking slightly, but she was too proud, too convinced of her actions to acknowledge it. She watched with a kind of smug satisfaction, her grip on the leash tightening as she waited for the officer to do what she thought needed to be done. "He doesn't belong here," she thought again, the words repeating in her mind like a mantra, a justification for her actions. This was her neighborhood, her carefully curated world, and the jogger, in her eyes, was an intruder. She could see the officer, a tall young man in uniform, standing just a few feet from the jogger, talking to him in a calm but firm tone. She could almost hear the conversation from this distance, but she didn't need to. She knew exactly how it was going to play out. The officer would search the jogger, maybe ask for his ID, and soon she'd be vindicated. He was a suspicious man. After all, how could anyone believe otherwise? Her heart swelled with a strange sense of victory. "He'll be detained soon," she thought, her lips curling into a tight smile. "This is how it's supposed to work," she muttered under her breath, her voice barely audible in the morning stillness. "He doesn't belong here." The words, coated with a mixture of superiority and entitlement, felt almost like a verdict, something she felt certain was right, because she'd never been wrong before. The jogger, however, was a picture of calm. He stood still, shoulders squared, and a quiet air of dignity about him. His expression remained composed as the officer asked him questions. It wasn't anger that stirred within him, but a sense of quiet frustration. He'd been stopped like this before, but rarely in such a suburban setting, and never under such suspicious circumstances. "Can I see some ID, sir?" the officer asked, his tone professional but not without a trace of caution. The jogger nodded, his face still calm. "Sure," he said, pulling his wallet from his back pocket and handing over his driver's license with a slight nod of acknowledgement. He met the officer's eyes without flinching, his voice steady. "I've got nothing to hide." He didn't raise his voice, didn't escalate the situation. He simply asked, "Can you tell me what this is about, officer?" The officer glanced at the ID, then looked back at the jogger, his eyes flicking briefly to the woman across the street, who was now standing a little straighter, watching intently. There was no denying it now. He was starting to see the situation for what it was. The officer sighed, shifting his stance as he processed the ID. The jogger's name matched the address on the license, and the situation was beginning to feel more and more unnecessary. "Look, I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but we have to follow up on these calls. It's a routine check," the officer explained, his voice softening. "But I can tell you're not a threat. This really is a case of mistaken identity." He then turned toward the woman, who was still holding her phone, her lips pursed. "I don't think he's a danger to anyone," the officer said gently, "but maybe you could reconsider the nature of the call. There's no need for this level of concern. He's just out for a run." The woman didn't budge. Her eyes were locked on the officer now, an odd mix of disbelief and irritation clouding her face. "You don't understand," she snapped, still holding the phone in her hand as if it might somehow validate her actions. He doesn't belong here. I'm telling you, something's wrong. Her voice grew increasingly defensive, even though the officer's stance was calm. She wasn't ready to admit her mistake. Not yet. Not in front of the jogger. Not in front of anyone. The whole neighborhood was watching. She couldn't be wrong. But the jogger's patience was beginning to fray. He still didn't raise his voice, but there was a quiet edge to his words as he turned to the officer. "Look, I don't want any trouble. I just want to finish my run," he said, a small sigh escaping his lips. He didn't want to escalate things, but something inside him finally clicked. He decided to take a different approach, a subtle shift. He gave a slight smile, trying to ease the situation, even though it seemed almost impossible. "I have a question," he said, glancing at the officer. "By any chance, do you know where my new boss lives around here?" His voice was light, almost casual, as if he were talking about any normal interaction. He was calm, professional, unshaken. The officer looked at him, a bit confused. "Your boss?" he repeated, the curiosity in his tone evident. "Who's your boss?" The jogger tilted his head, the subtle hint of amusement in his expression. "Oh, the woman who lives 2 houses down," he said casually, his words almost matter-of-fact. "She's my new supervisor. I'm meeting her later today, first day at work." The officer blinked, caught off guard. He looked back at the jogger's face, then turned to glance at the woman who had placed the call. The tension in the air seemed to freeze for a moment. The woman's smile faltered. The jogger's words had cut through her certainty like a knife, and suddenly, everything shifted. Her brain started processing the information in a slow, painful rush. She had just called the police on a man who, by all appearances, was simply exercising. And that man was the new executive her company had hired for a key leadership position. Her mouth went dry as the realization hit her like a freight train. She had received the email just the other day. Her company had hired a black man for a high-profile position, someone she had never met but was told would be working directly with her. And now here he was, standing right in front of her, looking at her with that same calm expression. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't just a coincidence. The man she had so casually labeled out of place, the man she had felt so uncomfortable with, was now her new boss. A sudden flash of recognition struck her. A memory surfaced, her boss's voice, calm and confident on the phone, welcoming her to the new corporate structure. But it wasn't just his voice, his name, his position, all of it came rushing back. And now he was standing here, right here, having been wrongly accused because she, in her judgment, thought he didn't belong. Her mind raced as a sickening feeling churned in her stomach. Her eyes darted from the jogger to the officer, then back to him again. She wanted to speak, to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. The reality of the moment was too overwhelming. She hadn't just misjudged a random person. She had targeted the man who was now her superior. The officer took a step back, glancing between the jogger and the woman. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but he could see the wheels turning in the woman's head, and he could see the jogger, unfazed, still standing tall despite the tension. In that moment, the woman's face reddened as she stood frozen, her mind a whirlwind of panic and regret. Her worst fear, the one she never admitted to herself, had just come true. The jogger, finally realizing the depth of the situation, simply nodded and turned to the officer. "I'll just go finish my run," he said, his voice cool, detached. "Have a good day, officer." And with that, he jogged away, leaving the woman standing there in the full, suffocating weight of her own ignorance. The moment the jogger jogged away, the woman stood frozen, her mind still reeling. It was as if the ground had been pulled out from under her, and for a brief moment, she had no idea how to regain her footing. The smug satisfaction that had been bubbling inside her only moments ago was now replaced with a thick, suffocating embarrassment. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched him disappear around the corner. "He's my boss. He's my boss." The thought circled in her mind, growing louder with each repetition, like a drumbeat marking her failure. A nervous laugh escaped her lips, high-pitched and strained. It wasn't genuine. It was a reflex, a pitiful attempt to mask the discomfort gnawing at her insides. She glanced over at the officer who was beginning to walk away, the tension easing from his posture. He seemed unbothered by the whole situation. The jogger, too, was clearly moving on with his day. But the woman, now more aware than ever of her own blunder, felt trapped in her own skin. Trying to gather her composure, she took a few hesitant steps toward the jogger, who had slowed his pace but hadn't stopped completely. Her feet felt like lead, and every inch she moved closer seemed to stretch time. The feeling of her previous certainty, of being in control, had all but evaporated. She called out to him, her voice sounding oddly loud in the quiet morning. "Excuse me. Wait, I just wanted to apologize," she said, her words tumbling out awkwardly. She cleared her throat, trying to regain some of the professionalism she was known for in her career. The jogger slowed his pace, turning slightly to acknowledge her, but his face was still calm, unbothered. He'd clearly moved past the incident, but there was a glimmer of something like amusement in his eyes, perhaps the only acknowledgement of the absurdity of the situation. "I'm sorry," she continued, her voice strained. "I didn't know you were—" She faltered, feeling the weight of her words crumbling under the pressure of her guilt. "I mean, I didn't think you were— I didn't mean to make assumptions, but She trailed off, unable to finish. The excuses sounded feeble, even to her. She felt herself shrinking under the weight of her actions. There was no coming back from this. The jogger gave a small, polite smirk. "No problem," he said smoothly, his voice calm and forgiving, but there was a certain sharpness behind his words. "I understand. It happens." There was no anger in his tone, no harshness, just an unspoken acknowledgement of the awkwardness of the situation. But even as he offered his reassurance, it was clear that he wasn't going to let her off the hook. He wasn't going to indulge her. He had already moved on from the incident. The woman stood there, her face burning with shame as she tried to salvage some dignity from the situation. She was a woman of status, a woman used to being in control. But in that moment, she felt small. The officer, who had been watching the exchange from a distance, gave a slight chuckle to himself as he walked back to his patrol car. He had seen this kind of thing happen before, a case of mistaken judgment that deflated as quickly as it had inflated. He wasn't surprised. It was a dynamic he had witnessed more times than he cared to count. A person who thought they were doing the right thing, only to realize that their assumptions had been wildly off. As the officer got into his car, the woman turned back to the jogger, determined to regain some semblance of composure. She could feel her pulse racing as she summoned her last ounce of professionalism, but there was a noticeable edge of desperation in her voice now. "Well, I hope we can put this behind us," she said, forcing a tight smile. It's a misunderstanding, of course. I'll be looking forward to working with you." She hoped he would say something to ease the discomfort, to validate her words, to offer some reassurance that the whole thing wasn't as catastrophic as it felt. But the jogger simply nodded, his face unreadable. "Yeah," he said, his voice polite but distant. "I'm sure we'll work together just fine." His response was neutral, detached. He wasn't trying to be rude, but neither was he buying into her attempt to save face. The woman realized then that she had overestimated the power of her apology. This wasn't going to be a moment she could just gloss over. It wasn't something she could erase with a few well-meaning words. The jogger had seen through the whole charade, and while he hadn't escalated things, he wasn't going to pretend that the situation was anything less than what it was. With a final polite nod, he turned back to his run, his footsteps quickening as he left her behind. The woman stood there for a moment, still on the sidewalk, watching him disappear into the distance. Her heart ached with the weight of what had just happened, but there was no immediate way to undo it. She had been caught in the act of judging someone based solely on their appearance, and in doing so, she had shown the worst part of herself. It wasn't just a bad moment. It was a wake-up call. Her gaze shifted back to the officer's car, now pulling away. The sound of the tires on the asphalt a distant reminder that this wasn't over. The tension was fading, but the shame lingered. For a long while, the woman remained standing there, lost in thought. She had no words left. The jogger's calmness had unsettled her in a way she hadn't expected. There were no grand confrontations, no raised voices, just the weight of her own assumptions, and the undeniable truth that she had been the one who had gotten it all wrong. And now, as she turned to head back to her house, she knew that this incident, this moment of realization, would follow her for a long time. She would have to face it, because no matter how much she tried to hide from it, it was now a part of her story. But in that moment, she also knew one thing for sure. She could never look at herself the same way again. The woman paced around her home, her thoughts swirling in chaotic circles. The incident, still fresh in her mind, replayed over and over like a broken record. She had tried to shake it off when she first returned, offering weak justifications to herself. But now, in the quiet of her living room, there was no escaping the truth. She couldn't hide behind excuses anymore. Her mind was filled with 1,000 thoughts. I called the police on him. She winced at the words, as if they were a painful echo she couldn't escape. I made assumptions about him. The weight of her actions settled heavily in her chest, as if her body was physically rejecting what her mind had allowed to happen. The jogger's calmness throughout the entire situation contrasted sharply with her own inner turmoil. He hadn't even broken a sweat, while she had felt the pressure of every second, every word, bearing down on her. And yet, in the end, it was her who was left exposed. For the first time, she allowed herself to confront the full depth of her mistake. The truth was undeniable. She had acted based on biases she didn't even fully acknowledge until now. It wasn't just that he was black. It was everything that came with that. It was her own stereotypes about what people from certain backgrounds deserved to be doing in certain neighborhoods, her misplaced sense of authority over the space she thought she owned. She sat on the couch, her hands gripping the armrest as the weight of self-realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She wasn't just upset with the jogger. She was disgusted with herself. How could I have done this? She thought. How could I have let myself go so far? This was no longer just an incident she could chalk up to a misunderstanding. It wasn't about a jogger running through a neighborhood or a woman who felt entitled to call the authorities. This was about the very core of who she was, someone who had hidden behind her carefully constructed image of professionalism, only to have it shattered by her own ignorance and unconscious racism. She wasn't just dealing with the embarrassment of her mistake. She was confronting the reality that she had deeply ingrained biases she needed to face. The reality of working with this man, who now stood in a position of power over her, added a layer of complexity to the internal conflict she felt. The irony of it all wasn't lost on her. She had called the police on the man who was now her boss. The stark contrast between the power dynamics that had played out during the police encounter and what was to come in the office was almost too much to bear. The thought of facing him again, after everything, made her stomach turn. The jogger, on the other hand, had long since forgotten about the incident. After he had finished his run and gone on with his day, he met with his new boss, who, as fate would have it, was the same woman who had called the police on him earlier. It had been a cordial, professional meeting, with nothing out of the ordinary, except for the nagging feeling in the back of his mind. Did she recognize me? He wondered briefly. Did she even remember calling the cops? But he pushed the thought aside. It didn't matter. He wasn't about to waste time dwelling on something that was ultimately inconsequential to his day. He had a job to do, and that was what he focused on: his professionalism, his performance, his goals. The woman, for her part, was professional during the meeting as well, but there was something different about her demeanor. Her handshake was a little too firm, her smile a little too forced. He could see through it, but he didn't dwell on it. He'd worked with people like her before, people who struggled to deal with someone from a different background in a position of authority. He didn't take it personally. Instead, he focused on the work, keeping his thoughts on the bigger picture. It was clear to him that there were going to be some awkward moments ahead, but nothing that couldn't be dealt with. He was, after all, just doing his job. As the days passed, the woman continued to struggle with the realization of what had transpired. She would try to bury it in the back of her mind, focusing on work tasks, but every now and then, the image of the jogger, the man who was now her superior, would flash into her consciousness. She would imagine him during meetings, and her stomach would churn with discomfort. How could she possibly go from calling the police on him to reporting to him every day? It wasn't just about her own discomfort. It was the awareness that she wasn't the only one who would notice the shift in power. Her colleagues would too. The very people who knew the backstory of the man who had been wrongly accused would also know that she was now working directly under him. The irony was almost unbearable. The first few meetings she had with him were filled with awkwardness, more on her part than his. He was calm, professional, and didn't seem to carry any resentment for the encounter. But she couldn't help but feel the weight of her actions. She wanted to apologize, but something held her back. She didn't know how to address it. Didn't know how to admit to someone that she had, in essence, dehumanized him based on nothing more than the color of his skin and the assumptions that went along with it. Meanwhile, he continued to work with a level of professionalism and grace that seemed to be contagious. Her colleagues respected him, admired him even. He earned his place not by dismissing the awkwardness of the situation, but by rising above it. He didn't need to make a big deal out of the past. What mattered was the present and the future, and in that, he was leading the team effectively. As the weeks passed, the woman found herself slowly adjusting to the reality of working with him. There were moments when she could still feel the sting of embarrassment, but they were fewer. She had to admit, as time went on, that she respected him, not just for his role in the company, but for the grace with which he had handled the situation. The final irony, of course, was that the woman who had so fervently believed she was in control of her professional world was now forced to reckon with the fact that she had no power over her own biases. In the grand scheme of things, her assumptions about this man hadn't just been wrong, they had been destructive. She had taken actions that could have irreparably damaged her career and her reputation, and yet the jogger, now her boss, had managed to maintain his dignity and professionalism throughout. He never made a big deal of the incident. In fact, he seemed to take it in stride, recognizing that these things happen and that the only way to move forward was with grace. He was not going to let the situation define their working relationship. For her, though, the situation became a profound lesson in humility. She would never forget the way her biases had been exposed, and how, ironically, those biases had led her to the very person who now had the authority to shape her professional future. The story would always be a part of her, a part of both of them. But the jogger, in his calm dignity, had long since moved on. For him, it was just another day at the office. For her, it would be a lifelong reminder that judgment based on appearances never leads to anything good, and that true professionalism comes from the ability to rise above one's own prejudices. And in the end, she couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for him, the man who had, without even trying, taught her the most important lesson of all. You cannot control your biases, but you can control how you respond to them. In the weeks that followed, the woman began a quiet but profound internal journey. The incident that had initially filled her with shame and humiliation became the turning point in her life, a catalyst for reflection and growth. At first, she had tried to compartmentalize the experience, to push it aside as a one-off mistake. But the more she thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about the jogger. It was about her. She began to confront her unconscious biases, those assumptions that had remained hidden for so long. She had always prided herself on being a professional, someone who made decisions based on logic and merit. But the events of that day had forced her to face the uncomfortable reality that no matter how progressive she thought herself to be, she too was susceptible to the prejudices that pervade society. For the first time, she understood just how easily those biases could shape actions, how a simple misjudgment could lead to calling the police on an innocent person. It wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern, one that took root in subtle, often unacknowledged ways. Her process of change wasn't immediate or easy. She didn't suddenly become a paragon of social justice, nor did she expect herself to. But she did start to listen more, to be more aware of her assumptions, to question her snap judgments. She took steps to educate herself, reading books on unconscious bias and diversity, engaging in conversations with people who had different perspectives, and examining her own past actions through a more critical lens. As her awareness grew, so did her resolve to change. The discomfort she initially felt around her new boss slowly evolved into respect, not just for his professional abilities, but for the grace with which he had handled the entire situation. She knew she could never undo her mistake, but she could move forward, a little wiser and a lot more humble. Meanwhile, the jogger continued his morning runs, blissfully unaware of the extent to which his life had been intertwined with hers. For him, the incident was little more than a blip on his radar, something that had come and gone without leaving much of an impression. He had handled the situation with an unspoken grace, showing no bitterness, no anger, just calm professionalism. His response to the woman's actions was a quiet reminder that sometimes it's not about confronting people head-on or making a big scene. It's about rising above the noise with dignity and intelligence. As he jogged through the neighborhood each morning, the world around him seemed to move in rhythm with his steady pace. He wasn't bogged down by the past. He was living in the present, focused on his goals, his work, and the opportunities that lay ahead. The woman, though, carried a lesson with her now, a lesson she couldn't ignore no matter how much time passed. And so, as the days stretched into weeks and the weeks into months, both their lives continued to unfold, but now with a deeper understanding of biases, of the weight of judgments, and of the lasting impact those judgments could have. The woman had learned a painful but necessary lesson, that assumptions, especially based on appearances, carry consequences. And for the jogger, life had continued in its peaceful rhythm, because for him, it had always been about more than just the jog. It was about living with grace, intelligence, and the quiet strength of knowing that, in the end, the only judgment that truly matters is the one we make of ourselves.